Good morning, and thank you very much, Mr. Goel. And first of all, thanks to the other panelists who have done a good job of defining the framework within which this discussion could be a lot more meaningful, and also to all the people who are watching this show. Now, my job has been made slightly easier by Dr. Bose as well as by Dr. Salam, who have defined the parameters, or if I might say, given a robust framework within which the discussion could happen. So my first question was that when we discuss issues like these, or concepts like these, like democracy or mobocracy, it can mean different things to different people. So to get onto a common platform was important. So I'll add just one or two things more to that definition, because most of it's been covered. One thing is that when the Greek combined demos and kratos, the two words, demos meaning the citizens living in a defined area, city, state, or whatever, and also kratos, which means power or rule. It was based on a belief of shared power, which meant there was a suspicion about concentration of power, whether by individuals, groups, or governments. And that's underlying democracy. So whenever democracy steps, and this is very relevant to the excellent points made by Dr. Abdul Salam, when you start looking at how democracy evolves or can evolve, this is an important definition, because there is a fear of or a suspicion of concentration of power, which has been the underlying basis for the I would say the genesis of democracy as well as its evolution. So that's one thing I would say, which is probably relevant for the discussions we are going to have. And the second thing in democracy is that democracy, whichever way you define, is a representation of the majority, which means there will always be a minority. 51% is enough to rule, so there'll be 49% who may not agree with everything that you do. So how do we manage those people, and how do we include them into the decision making, or how do we engage them with the decision making, and how do we communicate with that group which is not part of the ruling party or the winning party or the leading party in democracy is an important aspect. I think these are all relevant to look at not just what is democracy versus mobocracy, but why is it happening? Why is mobocracy increasing in places? Especially, let's focus on India, and I'll bring in overseas experience as we go along. So in the first part of this discussion, I'm going to mention a few things on which we could build later on. The first is that there's a minority that needs to be managed, or the losing party that needs to be managed in any democracy, because it just represents the majority. Even a 2/3 majority for constitutional change would mean that there could be a 1/3 out there who don't believe in what's being done. So that is one part of it. The second aspect is democracy has a very implicit value in it called restraint. And restraint is very important because it's a spirit of accommodation, which leads to a path of probably reconciliation. And democracy is the only political system that seeks to reconcile diverse aspirations and demands, and to bring welfare to the maximum number of people possible. Not to all the people, it's important, to the maximum number of people. There'll always be some outside that net who may not believe in it, who may not want to do it, or who may just have other agendas. So it's a very important distinction to make when we look at how democracy could evolve into the future. Now, mobocracy, on the other side, on the definitional aspect, it's in 1754 that it was first time used, as Merriam-Webster dictionary says. The other word that's used is ochlocracy. Ochlocracy is the rule of government by a mob, and the Latin, it close to the Latin phrase called vulgus, which also means the fickle crowd. Ochlocracy, according to Greek thinkers, is one of the three bad forms of government, which is tyranny, oligarchy, and ochlocracy. Those are three bad forms of government contrasted against three good forms of government, which is monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And the important question is good and bad in what sense? And that also they have defined. Good or bad depending on whether the government would act in the interest of the whole community or in the exclusive interest of a group or individuals. And that's where the distinction comes in terms of good and bad. If any of these forms of government is working in the interest of the whole community, then it is a form of good government. Whereas if it's looking parochially at the interest of a group of people, not looking at the entire populace or the population of a group that you're representing, then it's not a good government. So there's a good definition there. And going back to what Dr. Salam said about UAE, I've spent about 10 years in the Middle East, and I share the same view. As long as the government is looking after the common interest of the whole community, that's all that matters. Nobody cares about what form of government, who's making decisions, as long as decisions are being made in a timely manner and brings betterment to the livelihood of people. And that's a definition, that's it. So it doesn't matter what you define it or what name you give, what label you give it to them. I strongly believe in that view. And that's a very important distinction to make when we look at governments or autocracy or any of these forms of government. A couple of other distinctions. Democracy works within law and order. That's a big distinction. Whereas a mob has no mind. I'm quoting Gandhi here. They have no mind, no premeditation. They act in frenzy. And then what happens is the leadership that emerges out of a mobocracy plays to the gallery, plays to the crowd, because they are the gallery. And there is also an exclusion there. Any of these mobs do not represent the entire populace or entire constituents or interested stakeholders in any case. So there is a large interest groups that could be left out of a mob and its agenda. The second part is the legitimacy or the representation in democracy. Despite any large number of people coming together, mobocracy can never be the reflection of democracy. Again, Gandhiji. The entire population does not have the power or the right to elect either the representatives or the mob. The mob decides on its own, so it's not truly representative. So the legitimacy in representation is an important aspect, and also depends on context and position. Now, it's very interesting when we look at mobocracy, which is increasing in India, depending on your own beliefs, depending on one's own beliefs and interests, people justify mobocracy at times. When it comes to lynching, some people justify it, some people don't justify it. When it comes to any of these kinds of rebellions or uprisings, there can be two points of view. And rightly so. But the point is, when you reverse that, the same people who suppose mobocracy will come back and say the mob should not determine morality. So there is a dichotomy in the thinking there, because and it aligns with your own agenda, then you tend to support those kind of activities. And there have been many of these cases. Recently in India, in Kerala, there have been a few cases where a few women went and beat up a man who was spreading bad news about them in the social media. But then the court has very clearly said that you can't take law into your own hands no matter what, because that leads to anarchy and not to a stable form of government. And the last point I would make is, in a democracy, democracy protects minorities or individuals against short-term demagogues or moral panic. And that's a very essential part of it. Whereas in mobocracy, a mob could represent a very vested interest, and it could work against many, many other groups. So it is not in the interest of the country or in the interest of the group itself, because it may not be a sustaining action that they take in that process. I would also look at a couple of examples. Now, shifting it slightly because definitional issues are behind us, I'm going to look at why is it increasing in India. I'm going to look at some of the reasons. So in the next round of discussions, as usual, we can go into some solutions or potentially some suggestions for solutions. This has started in India right from the legislatures. The kind of mob behavior that has been displayed in state legislatures by MLAs, elected representatives of people, have been actually shameful. There is still a case in the High Court of Kerala where a group of politicians inside the assembly broke public property and caused damages. And then they come into power and they go to the High Court and say this case should be withdrawn. Shameful behaviors. This has gone on to the highest level. It has happened in Parliament as well. It has come to a stage where there have been people get into the middle of the Parliament, they tear up legislations, they do all sorts of things. So the mob behavior is demonstrated by elected representatives of the country. And going back to what Dr. Salam said, if a correction needs to happen, it needs to happen from people who we elect to represent this country, and such people should be accountable for that. They represent the highest values of democracy. They have been elected by a large number of people to represent our interests. And such shameful behaviors cannot be allowed. And there must be some kind of recourse and some kind of consequences for such actions. And that's one place we could really start. The second part is in terms of looking at mobs and why they happen. I mentioned earlier that there's always a group of people who are outside of the government, outside of the dominant groups, outside of the elected parties. How we deal with them have two aspects to consider. One, democracy progresses through a series of corrections. No government can make all the decisions perfectly correct. But the other option is not to make decisions, which some have adopted, but that's not the answer. So when 100 decisions are made, 10 of them may go wrong, 20 of them may go wrong, but the willingness to listen to people who you represent and faithfully represent their interests is an important one. It's a two-way dialogue. And when that dialogue breaks down, it can lead to mobocracy. And that is one big aspect which every ruling party or everyone who's in power should probably take a little more seriously in India. And that comes from a communication protocol or a communication exercise where people don't equally understand what is being said. And that's more true of India, where we have a lot of illiterate people, a lot of people with basic education or even less than basic education. And so how do we get those people to understand the implications of what is being proposed and the consequences of what is being proposed so that you get their buy-in is a very, very important part of democracy. And I don't think it's getting adequate attention. Here, I would say the media has a large role to play, but unfortunately, again, the media in India are getting very slanted and they're taking sides. So depending on who you represent or who you want to represent or who you believe in, media is also distorting information. If you look at mobocracy, a lot of mobocracy stems from distorted information bases. A lot of distorted information gets in and that's perpetuated and that's supplemented and it's amplified. All these things add to mob behavior because they say there is no other recourse, nobody's listening to us, whereas sometimes they don't understand what's the reality. I could go into some examples related to the present struggle in terms of agricultural law. I've spoken to different people and many people don't even understand what it means. And some people have already started using it, like in Kerala, there is a setup that's been done to bypass the spices board, and the cardamom growers have set up a unit to directly auction cardamom and get bigger prices. There are several misunderstandings about the contribution of Punjab and Haryana to agriculture. When you look at facts, they don't represent what it was before. There are many other states contributing, whereas 70% of the MSP seems to go to Punjab and Haryana. So I'm not against anybody. What I'm saying is if Punjab and Haryana takes the lead in setting the agenda for that through a mobocracy, then the decisions that are made may not be in the interest of the larger agriculturists in the country. So there has to be a balanced view of it. But I would immediately also at the same time say that it's a ruling party's responsibility to make sure that this understanding happens. So the investment into proper communications and I would say neutral communications or honest communications is a very important aspect in controlling this. There are many other points, but I would like to stop here because we could have probably a couple of rounds of discussions. I think I've introduced a few concepts here on which I'm sure the esteemed other speakers can build on. Thank you very much. Look at those 4 pillars. Let me just bring 30 seconds of my corporate experience. If you want a good operations, the first thing you do is a good recruitment. If you don't have good people to start with, you cannot have a good operation. And that's pure private sector thinking. Or take Indian Institute of Management. IIM is very good because they take the best people. No, it's not just the quality of the education itself. And being an educationalist, I'm sure Dr. Salam would agree to this. And unfortunately, politics is the only profession where there are no minimum standards. You can be illiterate. You can be anybody. And those days are gone because on one side, you have the representation and the trust of the people. On the other side, the ability to understand the complexities of the new world and to make meaningful decisions, what I call informed judgments, is extremely important in today's democracy. And if that is not there, and it cannot work. So I think control, and I would probably close it in the interest of time to say that, to Dr. Bose, saying that I think there is a need for a very powerful committee to look at reforming democracy. And in a very serious manner, because there are some very important issues. Why don't we take services to the people? I also have some serious concerns about the IAS cadre. Dr. Bose is an exception. Because the kind of training, the kind of consolidation of power at a collector's level was probably very suitable for the British regime to rule the country. And there are very good officers, there are very bad officers as well. But the concentration of power in a district collector is very high. The judicial, there's all kinds of powers concentrated, and that's easy prey for politicians.